Your Honor, with all due respect, my wife is a leech. The word hung in the sterile, over-air-conditioned air of the Denver courtroom. I sat completely motionless at the heavy oak defense table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, staring straight ahead. For 18 years, Rob continued, his voice dripping with a practiced, theatrical exhaustion, I have broken my back to provide for our family. I have missed birthdays. I have traveled across the country, spending countless nights in lonely hotel rooms just to keep a roof over our heads. And what did she do? She contributed nothing, not a single dime. She has never worked a day in her life. She is a dependent in every sense of the word, and now she wants to bleed me dry and take the very home I paid for. She wants to leave me and our children with nothing. He even managed to produce a single tragic tear, wiping it away with the cuff of his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. The suit I knew cost exactly $4,250. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for merciless rulings, looked over the top of her reading glasses. Her gaze shifted from Rob's tragically heroic posture to me, sitting there in a modest beige cardigan. I looked exactly like what Rob was describing, a meek, overwhelmed, financially illiterate housewife who had just been discarded for a younger, shinier model. Rob's attorney, a shark in a pinstripe suit who charged $800 an hour, leaned back in his chair and smirked. They thought they had it in the bag. They thought this was going to be an absolute slaughter. Rob was petitioning for full ownership of the house, 90% of the assets, and primary custody of our 2 teenagers, claiming I lacked the financial means and basic life skills to support them. He wanted to leave me on the street with a paltry alimony check that wouldn't even cover rent for a studio apartment. He was so incredibly confident. He was so sure he was the smartest person in the room. But as I sat there listening to the man I had slept next to for nearly 2 decades commit blatant, undeniable perjury under oath, I didn't feel panic. I didn't feel the crushing weight of betrayal anymore. All I felt was the cool, hard plastic of a small red flash drive burning a hole in my lawyer's briefcase. Rob didn't know it, but his entire reality was about to shatter in approximately 3 minutes. You see, for 18 years, Rob thought he had me perfectly controlled. He controlled the joint checking account. He gave me a strict allowance for groceries. He scrutinized the credit card bills, demanding receipts for every cup of coffee. He genuinely believed that while he was out earning a living, my days consisted of folding laundry, watching daytime television, and waiting obediently by the door for him to come home. He believed his own lies. He thrived on my supposed weakness. What Rob didn't know was that every single night, after he had his 2 glasses of scotch, crawled into bed and began to snore, I walked down to the unfinished basement. I would turn on 2 massive curved monitors hidden behind a false wall of holiday storage boxes, log into a secure encrypted server, and go to work. I wasn't just a housewife. I was a high-level technical translator specializing in aerospace and biometric engineering patents. I spoke fluent German, Japanese, and Mandarin. While Rob was allegedly closing deals in Omaha or Chicago, I was translating highly classified schematics for international tech firms, charging upwards of $250 an hour. I had been doing it for 15 years. I had built a 6-figure solo empire entirely under the radar, and I documented everything. Every cent I earned. Every offshore account I opened to protect my income from his increasingly erratic spending. I knew exactly how much money we had because, ironically, I was the one secretly funding the lavish lifestyle Rob loved to brag about to his friends. But the money wasn't the reason we were in this courtroom today. It wasn't the reason my heart was pounding a steady, militaristic drumbeat against my ribs. The real reason was what I had discovered when I started tracing the business expenses Rob was charging to an account he thought I didn't have access to. When I pulled the thread on his finances, the entire sweater unraveled, revealing a secret life so depraved, so utterly disconnected from the man I married, that it made me physically ill. He wasn't just cheating. That would have been almost cliché. The hotels, the jewelry, the lavish dinners, they weren't just for a mistress. Rob was funding an entire parallel existence, a sick, twisted double life paid for, unwittingly, by the late nights I spent staring at a glowing screen in a cold basement. He used my hard-earned money to betray me in the worst, most humiliating ways imaginable. And now, he was standing under oath, trying to destroy me for good, trying to erase me from my own life so he could walk away scot-free. "No further questions for my client, Your Honor," Rob's lawyer said, taking his seat with a self-satisfied grin. The judge turned her attention to my table. "Does the respondent have any cross-examination?" My lawyer, a quiet, unassuming man named David who looked more like a substitute math teacher than a high-stakes litigator, stood up slowly. He didn't carry a massive stack of files. He didn't puff out his chest. He simply walked to the center of the courtroom, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out that tiny red flash drive. "We have just a few questions, Your Honor," David said, his voice calm, almost dangerously soft. "And we would like to submit a new exhibit into evidence. Exhibit 402. I watched Rob's face. The smirk didn't fade immediately, but his eyes locked onto the small red object. For a fraction of a second, I saw it, the exact moment his brain tried to compute what that drive could possibly hold. He still thought I was the stupid, dependent wife. He still thought he was untouchable. He had no idea that plugging that drive into the courtroom monitor wouldn't just prove I was the primary breadwinner. He had no idea it was about to display high-definition, undeniable proof of exactly where his business trips actually took place, who he was really with, and the illegal, horrifying things he was doing with the money he stole from his family. The silence that fell over that Denver courtroom when the first image flashed on the screen is a silence I will carry to my grave. It was the sound of a man's entire life being vaporized in real time. The judge literally gasped, her hand flying to her mouth before her eyes snapped toward Rob with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. But to truly understand the sheer magnitude of what was on that screen, to understand the devastating trap I had spent 6 agonizing months setting for my husband, and how I managed to keep a massive corporate career completely hidden from the man sleeping inches away from me every night. We have to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to the exact moment I realized my 18-year marriage was nothing but a masterclass in gaslighting and financial betrayal, and the terrifying, empowering choice I made to stop being a victim and start being the architect of his absolute ruin. To understand how I ended up sitting in a sterile Denver courtroom with a flash drive that could obliterate a man's existence, you have to understand how the trap was initially built. It wasn't built with iron bars or locked doors. It was built with velvet ropes, sweet promises, and a slow, methodical erasure of my independence. When I met Rob, I was 22, a linguistics savant working on my master's degree, dreaming of a career at the UN or in international intelligence. I breathed languages. I saw the world in syntax and structure. Rob was 26, a junior executive with a jawline out of a magazine and a smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He swept me off my feet with a tidal wave of charm and aggressive adoration. But looking back, the warning signs were flashing neon red from the very beginning. "You work too hard, baby," he would say, taking my textbooks out of my hands at 2 in the morning. "When we're married, you won't have to stress like this. I'm going to take care of you. I want you to have the luxury of just being my wife." At 22, exhausted and overwhelmed, that sounded like a fairy tale. I didn't realize it was a cage. The moment the ring went on my finger, the subtle shifts began. It started with my master's program. Rob got a promotion that required relocation, and he convinced me to take a gap year that quietly stretched into a permanent withdrawal. Then came the consolidation of our finances. "It just makes sense to have everything in one place," he argued, smoothly transferring my modest savings into an account he controlled. "I'm a finance guy. Let me handle the boring numbers so you can focus on making our house a home." Within 3 years, the charismatic provider had morphed into a financial warden. By the time I was 26, I was completely dependent on him. And Rob reveled in it. He instituted the household budget. Every Sunday night, we would sit at the kitchen table and he would dispense my cash allowance for groceries and household essentials in crisp $20 bills. If I needed anything outside of that, a haircut, a new pair of shoes, a copay for the doctor, I had to submit a verbal request. I had to justify my needs to my own husband like a teenager begging for movie money. The gaslighting was a masterclass in psychological warfare. If I questioned his spending, the new golf clubs, the sudden upgrades in his wardrobe, the expensive dinners with his clients, he would sigh, rubbing his temples in performative frustration. "You just don't understand how corporate America works," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I have to look the part. I have to play the game so you can sit here in your nice, air-conditioned living room doing nothing all day. Do you think I like this? I do this for us." I believed him. For years, I genuinely believed I was the weak link in our marriage. I believed I was bad with money, naive, and incredibly lucky to have a man willing to shoulder the terrifying burden of the real world. I internalized every eye roll, every heavy sigh, every subtle jab about my easy life. When he started coming home late, smelling of scotch and expensive hotel soap, I convinced myself it was just the stress of his grueling travel schedule. When he began to mock my intelligence in front of his friends, "Oh, don't ask her about the economy. Her biggest decision today was choosing between fabric softeners," I simply laughed along, swallowing the bile in my throat. The breaking point didn't come from a dramatic argument. It came from a $600 emergency veterinary bill. Our golden retriever, Max, had swallowed a piece of a broken toy and needed immediate surgery. I rushed him to the clinic, terrified, and called Rob to ask him to transfer funds to the debit card so I could pay the deposit. He refused. I stood in the lobby of the animal hospital, tears streaming down my face, begging my husband of 7 years for the money to save our dog. "It's not in the budget this month," he said coldly over the phone. "We're not going into debt for a dog. Bring him home. If he makes it, he makes it." He hung up. I didn't bring Max home. I called my elderly parents, swallowing every ounce of my pride, and begged them for a loan. They paid the bill. Max lived, and a fundamental, irreversible shift occurred in my soul. I realized with terrifying clarity that I was one bad mood away from destitution. I was a hostage. If Rob ever decided to cut me off, I would be on the street. I had no resume. I had no credit score. I didn't even have a bank account in my own name. That very night, after Rob fell asleep, I went down to the basement. I dusted off an old, slow laptop I had hidden in a box of college memorabilia. I opened a private browser and I started searching. I still had my languages. I still had my brain. I just needed a way to monetize them without him ever finding out. It took weeks of navigating dark forums and freelance portals, using a digital VPN and a pseudonym. I applied for dozens of high-level translation jobs, terrified that my skills had rusted. But fluency in Mandarin, Japanese, and German, coupled with an obsessive attention to detail, is a rare commodity. My first contract was translating a massive technical manual for a German automotive company. I worked from midnight to 4 in the morning, typing furiously in the glow of the screen, terrified every time the floorboards creaked above me. When I finished the project 2 weeks later, an offshore payment processor wired $1,500 into a newly created, highly secured digital wallet. I stared at the balance on the screen until my eyes burned. It wasn't just money. It was oxygen. It was freedom. From that moment on, the housewife died and the architect was born. I became a ghost in my own home. I expanded my operation. I taught myself the incredibly complex terminology of aerospace engineering and biometrics. The harder the translation, the higher the rate. I started taking on contracts for international tech firms, defense contractors, and medical research facilities. They didn't care who I was or where I lived. They only cared that my translations were flawless and delivered ahead of schedule. I built the false wall in the basement myself. I bought plywood and drywall from Home Depot in small increments, paying in cash, and constructed a hidden alcove behind a wall of heavy plastic bins labeled Christmas decorations. Inside that alcove, I built a state-of-the-art command center, 2 curved monitors, a specialized ergonomic keyboard, and a high-speed encrypted server. By year 5, I was making $90,000 a year. By year 10, I broke the $250,000 mark. I hired a brilliant, discreet financial advisor based in Zurich. We set up an LLC in Delaware, a maze of shell corporations and offshore accounts that were virtually untraceable. I was paying taxes meticulously, but legally structuring it so that my name was buried under layers of corporate anonymity. Living this double life required superhuman endurance. My routine was brutal. I would wake up at 6 in the morning, make Rob his organic steel-cut oatmeal, iron his shirts, and play the role of the subservient wife. I would manage the household, do the grocery shopping, and raise our 2 children with intense devotion. At 6 in the evening, I would have a hot dinner waiting. I would listen to Rob complain about his stressful day, massage his shoulders, and stroke his ego. And then, at midnight, when his heavy, Scotch-induced snoring echoed through the master bedroom, I would slip out from under the covers. I would walk down to the cold basement, move the heavy plastic bins, turn on my monitors, and become one of the most sought-after technical translators in the private sector. I averaged 3 hours of sleep a night. When the dark circles under my eyes became impossible to hide with makeup, Rob would smirk and tell me I was aging poorly. I just smiled and agreed, but as my hidden wealth grew, something strange started happening to our visible finances. Rob's spending began to skyrocket. He started taking more business trips. He demanded we buy a larger, ostentatious house in a gated community, claiming his bonuses were coming in hot. But because I still had access to our joint household account to pay the electric bill, I could see the truth. His income hadn't increased. In fact, it seemed highly erratic. The numbers weren't adding up. If he was buying $4,000 suits and putting a down payment on a Porsche, we should have been drowning in debt. We should have been bankrupt. I couldn't figure out how he was sustaining it until my Zurich advisor pointed out a glaring anomaly during one of our encrypted monthly check-ins. "Someone is injecting capital into your domestic joint accounts," my advisor told me, the confusion clear in his Swiss-German accent. "Large, erratic sums, always just enough to cover the massive outbound expenditures. It looks like money laundering." I was stunned. I hadn't been funneling my secret money into our joint accounts. I kept my empires strictly separated. So where the hell was Rob getting the money to keep our lavish lifestyle afloat? Was he embezzling from his company? Was he involved in something illegal? The fear that he might drag me and our children down in a federal indictment overrode my caution. I had to know what he was doing. I had to see his complete financial footprint. For 18 years, Rob thought he was the tech-savvy one because he knew how to set up the Wi-Fi router. He didn't know I had spent a decade and a half working alongside cybersecurity experts and defense contractors. Breaking into his personal laptop was laughably easy. I didn't even need to use brute force software. The arrogant fool used his own birth date as his master password. It was a Tuesday morning. Rob had left for a 4-day executive retreat in Chicago. The kids were at school. The house was dead silent. I sat at his pristine mahogany desk in his home office, a cup of black coffee in my hand, and logged into his master cloud drive. I was looking for embezzlement records. I was looking for unauthorized company transfers. I was prepared to find evidence of a mistress, the classic cliché second cell phone bills, hotel receipts, jewelry purchases. I braced myself for the sting of infidelity. I bypassed his superficial folders and dug deep into the archived financial logs, tracing the routing numbers of the mysterious cash injections. I cross-referenced the IP addresses, the timestamps, and the LLC names he was using. And then, the screen populated the results. I didn't feel a sting. I felt the floor completely drop out from underneath the foundation of my reality. My breathing stopped. My hands, which had typed thousands of words a minute for 15 years without shaking, began to tremble so violently I knocked my coffee cup off the desk. It shattered against the hardwood, but I didn't even flinch. I just stared at the glowing pixels, my mind fracturing as the greatest, most devastating pattern interrupt of my entire life unfolded before my eyes. Rob wasn't embezzling from his company. He didn't have a company. According to the official termination documents, the severance agreements, and the HR emails sitting plainly in an archived folder, Rob had been fired from his executive position. Not last month, not last year. Rob had been unemployed for 4.5 years. For over 1,600 days, my husband had been waking up at 6 a.m., putting on a custom-tailored suit, kissing me goodbye, and driving off into the city to do absolutely nothing. Every promotion, every deal closed, every exhausting business trip to Chicago or Omaha. It was all a meticulously crafted psychotic fabrication. But if he hadn't earned a single paycheck in 4.5 years, how was he paying for the Porsche? How was he paying the mortgage on the mansion? How was he funding his trips? Frantically, my eyes darted across the screen, tracing the origin of the massive cash injections that had been keeping us afloat. The money flowing into his dummy LLCs. The money he was using to play the role of the alpha male provider. I traced the routing numbers backward, down the rabbit hole of international wire transfers, through a Cayman Island holding company, back to a payment processor. The routing numbers matched. They matched my secret offshore accounts. He wasn't laundering money for a cartel. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He had found my secret accounts years ago. He knew about my translations. He knew about my sleepless nights. He had quietly hacked my digital wallet, and for 4.5 years, he had been systematically siphoning my hard-earned money, filtering it back into our joint account, and claiming it as his own corporate bonuses to justify his massive ego and his unemployed existence. I wasn't a genius hiding a secret empire from an abusive husband. I was the unwitting sugar mama to a narcissistic parasite who had weaponized my own exhaustion against me and was using my own secret money to fund a parallel, horrifying second life. I sat there in his pristine home office, staring at the shattered ceramic of my coffee cup scattered across the hardwood floor. I forgot how to breathe. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like I was drowning in a sea of glowing pixels. He wasn't the provider. He was the parasite. But how? How did a man who couldn't figure out how to sync his own Bluetooth headphones bypass military-grade encryption and offshore firewalls? My hands flew across his keyboard, pulling up his network settings, and there it was. The answer was humiliatingly simple. He hadn't hacked my accounts. He had hacked me. 5 years ago, claiming he wanted to upgrade our home security, he had installed a commercial-grade keystroke logger on our primary router. He had been capturing every single password, every single login, every single stroke of my keyboard since the day I set up my first Zurich account. He watched me build an empire in the dark, and instead of confronting me, he simply opened a back door and started quietly skimming off the top. A normal person would have screamed. A normal person would have grabbed a baseball bat, marched upstairs, and smashed his $4,000 suits to pieces. But the woman who would have cried died right there on that mahogany desk. In her place, a very cold, very dangerous architect took over. If he was unemployed, if his entire corporate career was a phantom, then where exactly was he going when he packed his bags for a 4-day executive retreat in Chicago? I dug deeper. I opened his cloud storage, bypassing the dummy folders, searching for property deeds, leases, anything tied to the IP addresses he frequented. Within 20 minutes, I found her. Her name was Chloe. She was 25. A Pilates instructor living in a luxury high-rise in downtown Chicago. But she wasn't just a fling. She wasn't just a dirty little secret kept in cheap motels. Rob had created an entirely new identity for her. To Chloe, he was Robert Vance, a wealthy venture capitalist who traveled constantly for board meetings. He wasn't just sleeping with her. He was building a life with her. So I opened a folder labeled C_home. My stomach violently lurched. It was a Zillow listing for a pristine $2 million townhouse in the Chicago suburbs. Attached to the listing was a finalized mortgage agreement. He had bought her a house, but that wasn't the detail that made my vision go entirely black. I clicked on a PDF labeled J_receipt. It was an invoice from a boutique jeweler in the Diamond District, $38,000. for a 2-carat flawless cut platinum engagement ring. My husband of 18 years was engaged to another woman, and he bought the ring using the money I made translating German aerospace patents at 3 in the morning while he slept down the hall. He was hemorrhaging my cash to play a billionaire playboy in another state. But the worst part? The absolute, most psychotic part of it all? He was bringing the leftover stolen money back into our joint account, slapping me on the shoulder and telling me I was lucky to have a man who worked so hard to keep a roof over my head. I heard the garage door rumble open downstairs. Rob was home early. I had exactly 2 minutes to put the mask back on. I closed the tabs. I wiped the search history. I cleaned up the shattered coffee mug, throwing the shards into the kitchen trash just as the door from the garage swung open. "Hey, babe," he said, dropping his leather briefcase on the counter, exhaling a loud, performative sigh. "Brutal flight. The board is breathing down my neck. What's for dinner?" I looked at the man I had loved since I was 22. I looked at the custom suit I now knew he bought with my money. I looked at the exhaustion on his face that I now knew was from sleeping with a 25-year-old. "Steak," I smiled, my voice perfectly sweet, perfectly subservient. "Your favorite. Go relax. You work too hard." He kissed my forehead. "That's why I do it, baby. For us." He walked upstairs to shower. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite counter until my knuckles turned white. He thought I was his victim. He thought I was his bank. He had no idea he had just stepped into a slaughterhouse. For the next 6 months, I lived in absolute, terrifying psychological compartmentalization. By day, I was the clueless housewife. I ironed his shirts. I packed his bags for Chicago. I kissed him goodbye. By night, I dismantled his existence piece by piece. I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted total annihilation. I wanted him to hang himself with his own arrogance. But to do that, I needed him to commit a crime so undeniable, so heavily documented, that no judge in the country would show him an ounce of mercy. I hired a forensic accountant out of New York. I communicated with him via burner phones and encrypted emails. Together, we meticulously tracked every single dime Rob stole from my digital wallets. We built an airtight, irrefutable paper trail proving he committed wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny. Then, I hired a private investigator in Chicago. I gave him the address of the townhouse. For 3 months, I paid him to follow Rob and Chloe. I wanted everything. I wanted photos of him playing with Chloe's golden retriever. I wanted videos of them shopping for baby furniture. Because yes, Chloe, was pregnant. I documented his entire fraudulent existence. And I put it all on a single encrypted red flash drive. Then I initiated Phase 2. The trap. I filed for divorce. I didn't use my high-powered Zurich money to hire a celebrity lawyer. That would have tipped him off. Instead, I hired David. David was a quiet, cheap strip mall attorney who looked like he'd get bullied at a bake sale. Rob laughed in my face when he saw David's business card. It was exactly the reaction I needed. When the divorce proceedings began, I played my role to absolute perfection. I cried during depositions. I claimed I had no idea how finances worked. I let Rob's shark of a lawyer back me into corners. Rob took the bait entirely. Drunk on his own perceived superiority, Rob got greedy. He filed for sole ownership of our Denver house. He filed for primary custody of our teenagers. And, the absolute cherry on top, he submitted financial affidavits to the court under penalty of perjury, claiming an income of $450,000 a year and hiding every single asset he had secretly purchased in Chicago. He lied under oath, over and over and over again. Which brings us right back to the sterile air of the Denver courtroom. Right back to the moment David, my substitute teacher-looking lawyer, pulled the red flash drive from his jacket pocket. "Exhibit 402, Your Honor," David repeated softly. Rob's shark lawyer rolled his eyes. "Objection, Your Honor. Opposing counsel is introducing a digital exhibit at the 11th hour. We have no idea what this is. It's highly irregular." The judge, clearly annoyed by David's lack of presence, sighed. "I'll allow it, counsel. But this better be highly relevant, or I'm holding you in contempt." David didn't flinch. He walked over to the court clerk's terminal and plugged the red drive in. A massive flat-screen monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. "Your Honor," David said, pacing slowly in front of the defense table. "My client's husband has spent the last hour testifying that he is the sole provider for his family. He has testified to an income of over $400,000 a year. He has called my client a dependent, a leech, and a financial burden." David clicked a mouse. A document appeared on the screen. It was a W-2, or rather, a lack thereof. "This is an official termination letter from Mr. Vance's former employer. Dated 4.5 years ago, along with official IRS tax transcripts confirming that Mr. Vance has not earned a single cent of legitimate income in over 48 months. The courtroom went dead silent. Rob's smirk vanished. It didn't just fade, it was physically erased from his face. His jaw dropped slightly. He looked at his lawyer, who suddenly sat up straight, his pen freezing in mid-air. "Wait!" The judge leaned forward, squinting at the screen. "Counsel, are you telling me the petitioner is unemployed?" "Worse than that, Your Honor," David said, his voice dropping an octave. "He is a thief." David clicked the next file. A massive, complex financial flowchart appeared on the screen. It was color-coded, red lines moving from one account to another. "For 15 years, my client, the alleged Leech, has been secretly working as a highly paid technical translator for international tech firms. She earns approximately $300,000 a year. The funds were kept in legal offshore accounts in her name." The judge looked at me. The modest beige cardigan, the messy bun. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. "4 years ago," David continued, "Mr. Vance discovered these accounts. Using a keystroke logger on the family router, he stole her passwords, and for 4 years he has been systematically siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from his wife." "Objection!" Rob's lawyer barked, jumping to his feet, his face flushed. "This is absurd. This is a wild, unsubstantiated conspiracy theory." "Is it?" David asked. He clicked the mouse again. High-definition bank statements flooded the screen. Saw my Zurich account numbers, Rob's dummy LLC accounts, the matching timestamps, the exact penny-for-penny wire transfers. "These are the IP addresses verifying the transfers were initiated from Mr. Vance's personal laptop," David said. "He stole his wife's money, laundered it through a Cayman holding company, and then deposited it into their joint checking account, claiming it was his bonus from a job he didn't even have." Rob was physically shaking. His perfectly tailored suit suddenly looked like it was swallowing him whole. He grabbed his lawyer's sleeve, whispering frantically, but his lawyer just stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. The shark realized he had been fed a rotting carcass. "But why?" the judge asked, her stern facade completely shattered. "Why would he steal her money just to put it back into the household?" "Because he wasn't putting it all back, Your Honor," I spoke up. It was the first time I had spoken in court. My voice was calm. It was ice cold. It echoed off the oak panels. David clicked the final folder. The screen shifted. It wasn't spreadsheets anymore. It was a high-resolution photograph. Rob, wearing a polo shirt, standing in the front yard of a beautiful Chicago townhouse, his arm wrapped around a stunning 20-something blonde with a visibly pregnant belly. They were laughing. The judge audibly gasped. The court reporter stopped typing. "He was using my money to fund his second life, Your Honor," I said, staring directly into Rob's terrified, bloodshot eyes. David fired off the remaining files like a machine gun. "Exhibit 402-C, David announced. "A mortgage agreement for a $2 million property in Illinois, signed by Robert Vance. Exhibit 402-D, a receipt for a $38,000 engagement ring. Exhibit 402-E, video surveillance obtained by a licensed private investigator showing Mr. Vance living at this residence for 3 days a week." Videos began playing on the screen. Rob kissing Chloe. Rob buying groceries with Chloe. Rob driving a leased Porsche that was paid for by the late nights I spent translating German schematics until my eyes bled. Rob's lawyer slowly sank back into his chair. He didn't say a word. He didn't object. He just slowly slid his notepad away from him, creating physical distance between himself and his client. Your Honor, David said, standing tall now, the substitute teacher replaced by an absolute executioner. The petitioner sat in that chair, under oath, and swore he was the sole provider. He swore he owned the assets. He swore he had no hidden accounts. He has committed blatant perjury. He has committed wire fraud. He has stolen over $800,000 from my client to fund a fraudulent engagement to a pregnant woman in another state. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen right out of the room. I looked at Rob, the arrogant, condescending alpha male who had controlled my life, mocked my intelligence, and tried to leave me penniless on the street. He looked like a terrified child. He was hyperventilating, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles were trembling. The judge slowly took off her reading glasses. She didn't look at Rob's lawyer. She looked directly at Rob, and the pure, unadulterated venom in her eyes was a beautiful thing to witness. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice laced with a terrifying quietness. "In my 22 years on the bench, I have seen liars. I have seen cheats. I have never, in my life, seen a level of sociopathic financial abuse quite like this." Rob opened his mouth to speak. A pathetic, squeaking sound came out. Your Honor, I—" "Shut your mouth," the judge snapped. It was a crack of a whip. Rob flinched violently. "Do not speak. Do not breathe heavily. If you make a sound before I am finished, I will have the bailiff drag you into a holding cell." She turned to David. "Counsel, is a copy of this flash drive available for the district attorney's office?" "Yes, Your Honor," David replied smoothly. "We have already forwarded a duplicate to the Financial Crimes Division." Rob let out a strangled sob. He put his head in his hands, his perfectly styled hair falling out of place. He was weeping. The man who let me beg for $600 to save my dying dog while he was buying diamond rings for a Pilates instructor with my money was crying because he had finally been caught. "This divorce proceeding is immediately halted," the judge declared, striking her gavel. "I am freezing all of Mr. Vance's assets. I am transferring temporary emergency custody of the minor children entirely to the respondent. And Mr. Vance, I strongly suggest you retain a criminal defense attorney. Because when the DA is finished with you, you will be lucky if you ever wear a custom suit outside of a federal penitentiary again." The sound of the judge's gavel striking the wooden block echoed with a finality that seemed to shake the very foundation of the room. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, 18-year-long illusion shattering into a million jagged pieces. Rob didn't move. He sat frozen, staring at the polished wood of the defense table as if waiting for a trapdoor to open and swallow him whole. His breathing was shallow, rapid, the sound of a cornered animal realizing there was no way out. His attorney, the $800 an hour shark who had strutted into the courtroom so incredibly sure of an easy slaughter, didn't offer a single word of comfort. He didn't pat Rob on the shoulder. Instead, he systematically began packing his Italian leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a sharp, echoing click. Rob looked up, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Where are you going? You have to fix this. You have to object or file something." The lawyer paused, looking down at Rob not with pity, but with a cold, professional disdain. "I am a divorce attorney, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice flat and loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I don't represent clients who commit federal wire fraud, and I certainly don't represent clients who use me to suborn perjury in open court. My retainer is exhausted, and as of this exact second, I am officially withdrawing as your counsel. I highly suggest you don't speak to anyone without a criminal defense lawyer present." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Rob entirely alone at the massive oak table. I sat quietly next to David, my unassuming, brilliantly methodical lawyer. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The universe was currently balancing its scales with absolute, brutal precision, and I was simply bearing witness. The immediate aftermath was a blur of bureaucratic efficiency. Because the judge had referred the matter directly to the district attorney with irrefutable digital evidence of grand larceny and wire fraud, The gears of the criminal justice system began grinding almost instantly. Rob was not allowed to return to our Denver house. He wasn't even allowed to return to his leased Porsche, which, as it turned out, was rapidly repossessed once the DA froze every single one of his dummy LLC accounts. He walked out of that courthouse with nothing but the $4,000 suit on his back and a cell phone that was practically vibrating off the hook. Because while Rob's life was imploding in Denver, the shockwave was simultaneously detonating in Chicago. Part of the forensic accounting package David and I had prepared included a highly detailed dossier, which my private investigator had conveniently delivered to Chloe, the 25-year-old pregnant fiancée, at the exact moment our court hearing began. I didn't blame Chloe. She was just another victim in Rob's psychotic narrative. She genuinely believed she was engaged to a wealthy, successful venture capitalist named Robert. She had no idea he was married, unemployed, and buying her diamond rings with his wife's stolen translation money. When the feds seized the Chicago townhouse because it had been purchased entirely with stolen, laundered funds, Chloe didn't stick around. According to my investigator, she packed her bags, left the $38,000 platinum engagement ring on the kitchen counter for the federal agents to confiscate, and moved back in with her parents. She blocked his number and filed a restraining order before the weekend was over. Within 72 hours, Rob had lost his wife, his fiancée, his children, his homes, his cars, and his freedom. He was arrested at a cheap motel near the Denver airport on a Tuesday morning. The FBI had taken over the case due to the interstate nature of the wire fraud and the Cayman Islands laundering scheme. I wasn't there to see it, but I read the arrest report. They pulled him out of a $70 a night room, still wearing the same custom-tailored Tom Ford suit, now wrinkled and reeking of stale scotch and sheer panic. The trial never happened. Faced with the staggering mountain of evidence meticulously compiled on that small red flash drive, Rob's public defender advised him to take a plea deal. 3 months after he sat in family court and called me a leech, Robert Vance stood in a federal courtroom wearing an oversized, faded orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was gone, replaced by a harsh buzz cut. The arrogant, condescending alpha male was entirely erased. He looked small. He looked broken. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of federal wire fraud, 1 count of identity theft, and 1 count of perjury. Before the federal judge handed down the sentence, I was permitted to read a victim impact statement. I walked up to the podium wearing a sharp, tailored navy blue blazer. I didn't look like a meek housewife anymore. I looked exactly like what I was, the CEO of my own life. I looked directly at Rob. He couldn't even meet my eyes. He stared at his chained wrists. For 18 years, I spoke clearly, my voice echoing in the silent room. The defendant told me I was incapable of surviving in the real world. He told me I was financially illiterate, dependent, and weak. He locked me in a cage of velvet ropes and gaslighting, convincing me that I needed him to survive, while he was secretly draining the lifeblood of my hidden labor to fund a fraudulent existence. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. He thought I was his bank. He thought I was his victim. But the truth is, I was his architect. I built the wealth he stole, and I built the trap that caught him. I do not ask for pity today, Your Honor. I only ask for the maximum penalty allowed by law, so that the defendant can finally experience the one thing he has avoided his entire adult life: accountability. The judge sentenced him to 84 months in a federal penitentiary, with a mandate for full financial restitution upon his release. 7 years. 7 years in a concrete cell without his organic steel-cut oatmeal, his expensive golf clubs, or his illusions of grandeur. With Rob officially removed from society, the dust began to settle, and the monumental task of reclaiming my life began. The divorce was finalized with lightning speed. Because of his criminal convictions and the undeniable proof of his financial abuse, I was awarded 100% of the marital assets, including the Denver house, sole legal and physical custody of our teenagers, and the immediate return of every single dime he had funneled through his dummy LLCs. But the legal victory, as sweet as it was, wasn't the closure I truly needed. The real healing had to happen within the walls of my own home. The hardest part was sitting down with my two teenagers. They had spent their entire lives watching their father play the hero while subtly degrading their mother. Breaking that illusion was agonizing, but necessary. I sat them down in the living room and told them the truth. I didn't bash their father, but I didn't protect him either. I laid out the facts, and then I told them about the basement. I told them about the languages, the late nights, the international contracts, and the six-figure business I had built with my own two hands. My daughter, 16 years old and fiercely independent, just stared at me for a long time. Then, tears welled in her eyes, and she threw her arms around my neck. "You're a badass, Mom," she whispered. My son, quiet and thoughtful, simply hugged me and said he was proud of me. They didn't view me as a victim. They saw me as a survivor. The very next day, I went down to the unfinished basement with a crowbar and a sledgehammer. I didn't hire contractors. I wanted to do it myself. I swung that hammer into the false wall of drywall and plywood I had built to hide my existence. I smashed it to pieces, breathing in the dust, letting out years of repressed anger, anxiety, and exhaustion with every swing. When the wall was gone, I carefully unplugged my two massive curved monitors. I carried my ergonomic keyboard, my encrypted server, and my high-back office chair up the stairs, out of the dark, and straight into Rob's former pristine mahogany-paneled home office. I threw his superficial business books into the trash. I cleared his desk, and I set up my command center right in front of the massive bay window overlooking the front yard. I wasn't going to hide in the dark anymore. I was going to work in the sunlight. The business exploded. Freed from the draining, soul-crushing routine of playing the subservient wife, I suddenly had an extra 40 hours a week to dedicate to my career. I expanded my LLC, hired 2 junior translators to handle overflow, and signed exclusive retainer contracts with a major aerospace defense firm. Within a year of the divorce, my income doubled. But there was one final, incredibly important loose end I had to tie up. On a bright Sunday morning, I loaded our golden retriever, Max, into the back of my newly purchased SUV. Max was fully recovered from his surgery, a little gray around the muzzle, but as happy and loyal as ever. We drove 2 hours out of the city to my elderly parents' modest ranch house. They were sitting on the porch when I pulled up. They had been my lifeline when Rob had callously told me to let our dog die because it wasn't in the budget. They had loaned me that $600 from their meager retirement savings without a second thought. I walked up the porch steps, Max trotting happily beside me, and handed my father a small, plain white envelope. He opened it slowly, his hands shaking slightly from age. Inside was a cashier's check. My father's jaw dropped. He looked at the check, then looked up at me, his eyes wide with utter confusion. "Sweetheart," he stammered, adjusting his glasses. This is for $85,000. What is this?" "It's for the vet bill, Dad," I smiled, feeling a hot tear slip down my cheek. "With a little bit of interest. It covers the rest of your mortgage and the roof you guys have been needing to fix." My mother covered her mouth, sobbing instantly. My father tried to hand it back, his pride getting the better of him, but I gently pushed his hand away. "You saved my dog," I told him, crouching down to pet Max. "But more importantly, you saved me. Since that $600 woke me up. It showed me exactly who I was married to, and it gave me the push I needed to save my own life. Please, take it. I can afford it. I promise." Driving back to Denver that evening with the windows down and the cool mountain air rushing through the car, I felt a sensation I hadn't experienced since I was a 22-year-old linguistics student dreaming of the world. I felt completely, unapologetically free. Sometimes I still think about that sterile, over-air-conditioned courtroom. I think about the supreme arrogance on Rob's face as he sat there, confident that his lies would effortlessly crush me. I think about how easy it is for people to mistake silence for weakness and patience for stupidity. Gaslighting is a highly effective weapon, but it has a fatal flaw. It requires the victim to remain asleep. When you spend years telling a woman she is nothing, you run the very dangerous risk that she might eventually wake up, look around, and realize you are absolutely right. She is nothing like the weak, dependent character you've written for her. I didn't just survive my marriage. I extracted every ounce of my potential from its burning wreckage. I built a fortress out of the stones he threw at me, and when the time was right, I let the drawbridge down and watched his entire world collapse into the moat. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But that's not entirely accurate. Revenge isn't a dish at all. It's a tiny encrypted red flash drive, delivered exactly at the right moment, by a woman who refused to be erased. There is a profound, undeniable power in finally waking up, looking at the velvet ropes designed to hold you back, and deciding to tear them down yourself. You don't ever have to remain a supporting character in someone else's deceptive narrative. If you are ready to step out of the dark, take back the pen, and become the undisputed CEO of your own life, you are exactly where you need to be. This channel is dedicated to exposing the manipulators and giving you the exact blueprints for unapologetic survival, financial independence, and strategic comebacks. Hit that subscribe button right now to arm yourself with the tools and the truth you need to build your own fortress. Because your potential should never be hidden, and together we are building an empire of people who absolutely refuse to be erased.